Off air, yeah. Hi everyone, thanks for joining us today. Today you will learn more about customer contact reporting. We'll focus on the differences between synchronous and asynchronous teams. But before we start, I want to give some practical guidelines. This whole session will take about 30 minutes, and today we have 3 speakers. Let me give you a short introduction. Lena is our senior data engineer at Spark Central, and you may already know Goran. He is our head of product from the chatbot webinar as well. And they will be joined today by Alison, Vice President, Digital Markets and Product Strategy at Concentrix. Concentrix is a global business process outsourcer. They have a lot of experience in messaging programs, and they employ 250,000 contact center agents who will help customers over various messaging channels. So Alison will answer some pre-recorded questions because there is a time difference in the US. During this first 20 minutes, it will be Spark Central presenting, but you can send all of your questions in the chat on the right side, and we will answer them in the last 10 minutes during our Q&A. Also, a quick reminder, this masterclass consists of 5 webinars, and this is the 4th one. Due to illness of one of our speakers, we had to postpone the 3rd session, and we have postponed this until the 3rd of June. So if you're interested in these upcoming webinars, you can still sign up at our website. And if you have followed all of the 5 webinars, you will receive a certificate and a gift package. So I think we are ready to start. Like I mentioned before, we have 3 speakers, and first up is Goran. So Goran, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Lisa. And thank you all for joining. In the past few weeks, we have been talking about messaging channels for customer service. And by now we know that messaging is very much appreciated by customers. Customers like to use messaging channels both in their private life as well as when they are communicating with brands. And also you have come to understand that human agents and virtual agents can really work well together to drive efficiency while maintaining high customer satisfaction scores. And today we will talk about another very important topic, one of my favorite topics actually, and that's reporting. Optimizing your contact center performance without metrics is impossible. We all know that. However, messaging channels are much different than voice. And most brands we speak to are using voice metrics as a reference point. So that brought us to the following agenda for today. So we will talk about key metrics for messaging channels. We'll also do a deep dive in how messaging metrics are actually being calculated. It's called a masterclass, so that's really the deep dive piece which Lena will cover. We'll talk about the differences between messaging metrics and voice metrics. And finally, as mentioned, our partner Concentrix will join to share some of their insights, having implemented many messaging programs across the globe. So when you're new to messaging, we always recommend what we call a crawl, walk, run approach. It's really important that you learn to understand the dynamics of messaging channels, as messaging channels are very different. And you should give your organization the time to get accustomed to the messaging channels, because what you will find is that customers speak to you differently on messaging channels, and they might also have a different preference on when they are reaching out to your brand. But also from your internal organization perspective, looking at your customer service representatives, they will also have to get accustomed to this new form of communication. And finally, staffing. So how do you deal with large volumes of messages that come in? But actually those conversations can take place over multiple days even. So how do you optimize staffing for messaging channels? So all of these things are really important to take enough time in your organizations to start learning about these things. If you're looking at metrics, there are some metrics that are quite obvious to look at. So for one, messaging volumes. And if you start to use messaging, you might want to launch multiple messaging channels like WhatsApp, Facebook Messenger, maybe WeChat or others. And you will really start to learn what are the differences per country and what are the messaging channels that your customers prefer to use most. I think another important metric to look at is really at adoption rate. So how quickly are your volumes growing? And as mentioned also during the chatbot webinar, a growth of 200% for the first few months isn't uncommon. If you're not seeing this growth, you might want to consider to promote the channels more. And of course, you might need to also scale your team to accommodate the increasing volumes. I think key to the success of your messaging program is in how far you're able to fully resolve conversations that are taking place on messaging channels. Quite often, especially in the beginning, we would still see questions that cannot be answered, and you would still need to refer customers to maybe the voice channel. And that, of course, doesn't really help to promote messaging as a good alternative. Response times, especially like if you're using WhatsApp, customers do require fast response times. It doesn't have to be immediate per se, but definitely you need to take care of having a good initial response time. And I think another relevant topic is looking at handle times. So you will start to look at what are the topics people talking about and how much time are we spending for what topic, and then you can also start comparing handle time with voice channel. We actually had a recent example where we just learned that a voice agent might have 60 conversations in a day, while a messaging agent might even deal with up to 120 conversations in a day. So definitely we see the benefits. So handle times will give you those insights. I think the least, but the final one to look at is customer satisfaction. And I think a key metric which is quite obvious to measure is if it would be customer satisfaction scores measured as NPS or scale 1 to 5, or just to learn how they're experiencing those channels. So once you have those metrics, you can start improving your operation. For example, with team performance, if you start comparing conversations that your team has had with customers, you can start looking at what conversation has been perceived as very satisfying from a customer perspective, but also what are the poorly rated conversations. So of course you can start using those conversations to learn from as a team. Since you have all the content stored, you can also analyze what types of questions are being asked. And if some questions are being asked really frequently, you can start considering to use chatbots to automate such conversations. But also as an organization, there's an opportunity to learn. So if your marketing team would launch a new campaign, that might cause disruption in your contact center. So it's also good as an organization to have good communication between departments, but also learn from what your help desk is experiencing when other departments in your organization are communicating with your customers. So this might be a quote that you've seen flying around lately. Data is the new gold. And that being said, and organizations who have the most data will be most successful in the future. However, data in isolation has not so much value. So like gold, it needs to be manipulated and analyzed to get the most out of it. And that's why you've invited Lenne, and he will take us through how metrics for messaging channels are actually being calculated and how you can transform them into insights. So Lenne.
Yes, thank you, Garan, and hi there, all of you on the other side. Today we will find out together how data is collected in an asynchronous messaging system. But as Garan just mentioned, the data on its own is not where the real value is at. We will look into how this raw data can be transformed into more meaningful metrics, and we will find out how these metrics, at their turn, can lead to actionable insights, because that's where the true power of the data starts to reveal itself. These insights can help you identify ways to even further improve the contact with your customer. So let's start by looking into how the data is collected, but no worries there, our time is limited, so we will not dive too deep. So our question at hand is how to collect data in an asynchronous messaging system. And we're going to start off with an example of a typical conversation. We're going to look at the life cycle of an asynchronous conversation. So what you see here is the timeline of our conversation. And every step on the timeline represents an action. Let's go over the actions of our conversation together. So as you can see here, the first action is the contact sending a message with the text like, "Hi, I would like to," and then some question. Then the agent gets the conversation assigned in the queue, and the agent opens the conversation. The agent sends a reply, maybe with a question, for example, "Hi there, could you please provide me your invoice number?" Then it might take a while for the contact to look up this information. So it might be that the agent receives another conversation from the queue. So he jumps to another conversation. In this case, the contact, after finding out the invoice number, sends another message. So the agent goes back to the conversation and he opens it again, sends another reply. "Glad I could help you. We see each other later." And then the agent marks the conversation as resolved. This is the overview of the basic actions in our conversation. Now, before actions are stored in our database, they are transformed into events. Because events are actually actions, but they are enriched with relevant metadata. And as you can see, actions are formulated in the present tense, whereas event names are typically in the past tense. So this is an event, and this is actually what we store in our database. So the contact sends message becomes conversation with inbound message created, and we keep the metadata like the exact timing, the text, the contact identifier, channel information, and the medium, and so on. We all store that in our database so that we have it available for later use. So now, these events can actually help us answer a number of questions. Let's start with the first question. How long does it take for a customer to receive a first reply? It's a typical contact center metric. It's called the first response time, or in short, FRT. So we see our conversation event timeline again. And as you can see, it's easy to accurately determine our first response time. We just take the time between our conversation with inbound message created event and the first outbound message added to conversation event. In this example, this means that we have a first response time of 2 minutes. And as you can imagine, a short time to first response makes a good first impression. A somewhat longer time to first response might lead to frustration with the customer and the customer using another channel to try to contact you, which then in its turn generates duplicate conversation and makes it less efficient, the contact with the customer. Another question we might ask ourselves is, why is agent efficiency higher with this asynchronous messaging compared to phone calls? And to illustrate this, we will look into how much time an agent spends on a conversation. The time an agent spends on a conversation is also a known metric called the handle time. So we go again to our conversation timeline, but now we're looking into how much time an agent spends on the conversation in the queue. We look at the time between an agent opening the conversation, the agent sending a reply, and then the agent moving to another conversation which is assigned by the queue to him or her, or when the conversation is resolved, he will also go to another conversation. So here you can see we have two handle times, 2 times 1 minute, results in 2 minutes of handle time for this conversation. But now let's look what happens when the agent asks for information, some kind of an invoice number, like we already said, which the customer needs to look up. This could mean that the customer needs to look through emails, try to find some papers, even talking to others. This might actually take a while. And in a classic phone call situation, the agent has to wait for the customer to return. But in this case, the agent can decide to get the next appointed conversation and start working on that one. So for example, here, the conversation, the agent in this case gets a new conversation assigned, which is then opened by the agent, another conversation is sent and might be resolved. So as you can see, this is a much more efficient use of the agent's time and also leaves more room for the customer to find out the question, the answer to the question on his or her own pace. Because it's really annoying if you have to look up something on the phone and it takes a while, it might be stressful for the customer, while here the customer just comes back when he or her or she has found the answer. So with asynchronous messaging, we see that the agent's efficiency, the agent utilization in this case is close to 100%, which is very efficient use of the time. So besides first response time and handle time, we can answer a lot more interesting questions with this simple set of events. For example, the time it takes for a conversation to be resolved, the resolution time, or the time it takes to respond, on average or in total, that's the response time. And actually, we can generate a lot of new insights, anything that we can imagine, even later in time. Because we keep all these events, we can just replay them into a new insight whenever we want, also for historical conversations. So that makes the storage of events very interesting. So just to give you an idea, we have now collected and stored over 1 billion of events for our customers. So this is quite a lot of events, but they're not only related to conversations, but they cover a wide range of different topics in the contact center. And by actually starting to combine them, you can generate a lot of interesting insights, both historically by looking at evolution over time, and real time, allowing you to take decisions based on the current situation in your contact center. So we've seen how we can gather and structure these events, but now let's see what we can actually learn from them. So let's see how we can represent the data in a way that it can help you provide the best customer experience with the optimal use of resources. So a first case here, it's a pretty recent example. What is the impact of COVID-19 on the contact center inbound message volume? We can monitor trends for the topics of our conversations, and when the volume for a specific topic increases or significantly decreases, it might be a trigger for you to take action. So as you can see here, there was a huge increase in inbound messages mentioning Corona or COVID-19 starting the end of March. And when you detect this trend early, you can decide to take one or more actions. For example, you could temporarily increase staffing, you could organize some additional training, or you could set up a bot, for example, to accept voucher for a flight or to get more information about flight options. So that was a simple example. Maybe a more advanced example is how to determine optimal contact center business hours. So this is an overview of your business hours. The green parts indicate during business hours, and the gray parts are outside the business hours. And you can see an indication of how many new conversations are created by day of the week. These are the columns. And per hour of the day. These are the rows. And the more a cell is filled up with color, the more conversations are created for that day and hour. So let's perform a quick analysis on this example. We can clearly see the business hours starting 9 to 6. And during the business hours, we see that we have a high volume throughout the day. except on Friday, we typically see less conversations being created. Before the business hours, the volume is significantly lower, but after the business hours, we still see an elevated volume, especially on some weekdays, for example, Tuesday or Wednesday. So based on what you see here, you might decide to take action and adapt the opening hours, for example, or you could set up an autoresponder informing the customer about your business hours. So that's an interesting thing that you can learn by looking at a representation of events in terms of business hours. We have another case that we can look into. Wouldn't it be interesting to be able to monitor our customer satisfaction in near real time? We could dig into specific outlier conversations and monitor some trends, and these could help us take actions at the time events occur. So an interesting way to visualize customer satisfaction is actually the Emoji Cloud. It's an interactive diagram giving you a quick overview of the current or represented customer's sentiment. So emojis here are sized based on the number of times they occur in recent messages. And the more frequent an emoji occurs, the larger it appears in the diagram. In the interactive version, you can click on an emoji and then you can see all of the message which contain the emoji. So you can also open up the entire conversation to look into the context of the specific message which contains the emoji. And this can be a very helpful tool to monitor specific outliers, for example, an angry emoji, and also have a general overview of the current customer sentiment. What you can also do is you can filter the messages used for the emoji dashboard on specific topics or time range or a specific set of agents or teams. And you can explore and compare different situations with each other. It can also be interesting to afterwards correlate this overview to the feedback you actually received from the contact through, for example, CSAT or NPS or CES. Then you can see what the content of the message is compared to the feedback of the customer. Also, another tip is beware of the use of emojis because it can differ between countries and cultures. So, for example, the thumbs up icon is something that's frequently used as okay or well done, but in Greece and in some other countries, it's the equivalent of the middle finger. So it's really important to look into the context of the use of the emoji. So this concludes our third example. Back to you, Goran.
Thank you, Lena, for sharing those insights. And that reminds me of never sending a thumbs up emoji ever again. Anyway, really insightful. We've asked Alison from Concentrix, responsible for digital markets and product strategy, what differences they see between the voice and the messaging channel. And the answers have been pre-recorded. I think it still contains a lot of value in listening to what she has to say. And the first question we've asked her is, how do you recruit and train agents for messaging channels? Can you play the audio file, Lena?
Hired to do this type of work, we actually begin the training. That's a great question that you ask in regards to training. We are definitely and have developed an entire digital global operating model around digital assets, for instance, certainly from a technology perspective, but even more importantly from an agent perspective, where the type of individuals we've hired to do this type of work, we actually begin the training component really at recruiting and onboarding, so that we are hiring and recruiting for specific digital essentials that people should have, right? Can they type fast? Are they digital natives? Are they familiar with the different applications that are out there? Do they know how to use social channels? And once we do that, then we actually do bring them into a specialized training environment and experience that's built around understanding, for instance, not just the components around the platform or how to navigate screens, but really looking at understanding specific standards, right? What are some of the different things that you need to understand about messaging channels and about how you communicate differently in that channel? Things like, as simple as punctuation, as conversational styles. Those are all some of the things that go into training, and then we evolve that even into how how we're doing quality, how we're doing performance management. What are the best practices that we apply to those types of experiences, and that really actually helps make the entire messaging program successful over time.
So I think that those are relevant insights, and one of the things we also were very interested in to learn from Concentrix is on how they look at measuring agent performance for messaging channels specifically.
So we do measure performance quite differently from a messaging perspective than voice. Voice is very traditional. We use things like average handle time, after call work, where messaging really uses more average work time. Essentially, what is the time that agent is actively engaged on that interaction? We also measure that per interaction. So it is similar in some respects in how you're providing and measuring performance and effectiveness and efficiency, but you are looking at at different sets of KPIs, just in the fact that the nature of messaging is much different than voice, and those interactions tend to be shorter.
And I think what we have said before is that we see a lot of benefits when brands start to use messaging for their customer communications. And we also asked Concentrix the question if they see the same benefits from their program they are running.
We have seen some really great benefits from our clients moving from other channels to messaging. Specifically, some of the things that we're seeing, and keep in mind that we've been doing this for a couple of years. We have a really good basis of evidence for handling millions of interactions with customers across many verticals and different types of lines of businesses. Is, for instance, when customers are going from voice and they're adding a messaging channel as an option for clients in that voice channel, for instance, as an adjunct to an IVR experience, we're seeing productivity jump up from at least 20% to over 50%, depending on the type of transaction and interaction that's being serviced in that messaging channel. Customers also like it better, right? It's convenient channel, so we're also seeing NPS and CSAT go up. It's something that we expected to see, but we didn't expect to see double-digit improvements, and we have seen that at least 10 points in some of the programs that we're servicing with messaging.
So that was just a short intro from what we can learn from Alison. And I just wanted to highlight that by the end of June, we have another webinar scheduled with Concentrix to go much deeper into what should you consider when starting with messaging channels. So if you're interested, let us know and we can send you more information. So let's summarize on what we talked about today. So we suggest that if you're new to messaging, that it's really important to take the time to understand the dynamics of messaging channels. Give your organization time to learn how customers behave on those channels, how to best prepare your knowledge and your processes, and how to best manage your team, also from a staffing perspective. We also talked about the importance of data collection, but more so to really deep dive into your data to get a relevant insights to take action based on data that you have collected. And what Alison mentioned is that recruiting agents with the right skill set, the right digital skill set, is key for a successful messaging program. And I think a final one to take away from today is that messaging channels can definitely bring efficiency and also customer satisfaction in a customer service context. And maybe a bonus one that at least I like very much take away is that because we're storing those events, you can actually do a little bit of time travel, and yeah, that maybe is the closest to time travel we will ever get. So Lena, that was a great insight. Thanks for sharing that.
Thank you.
So are there any questions, Lisa, that we want to look at?
Hey, thank you, Goran and Lana. There are no questions yet, so if anyone still has questions, you can still ask them in the chat on the right side. But for now, there are no questions. So I want to invite everyone for upcoming webinars. And if you haven't signed up yet, it's still possible at sparkcentral.com. Thank you for listening. And if you have questions, you can still reach out and we will be happy to answer them. So, bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.